right now on a Monday morning. It's always time to welcome in Arthur Schwartz, the food maven. Good morning, Arthur.
Global warming is really affecting me personally.
Me too. I agree with you 100%.
I can testify to this scientific experiment here. I can't even eat, much less cook. Last night I had a slice of, I must say, very good bread, which was sitting on the counter, and I said, I really should eat that before it goes less good. And with peanut butter and a banana. That was dinner last night. Because, like I said, I can't turn on the heat in here. I did one day last week. And anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm still thinking cold food. Fortunately, we have this new supermarket around the corner. I keep mentioning, I think, every week for weeks now. But the reason I couldn't wait for this place to open is because they do make very, very high-quality spit-roasted chickens. I know everybody's got their favorite neighborhood place to get a and it's just like an American thing now, right?
Yeah.
You can buy a spit-roasted chicken in Sharon, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Every supermarket has a rotisserie like that. So but they use high-quality birds, and if you know how to time it, here's the thing with these spit-roasted chickens. You can't walk into a shop that sells them or a supermarket department that sells them without knowing the schedule of the roasting. So I've figured out that around the corner, they put the first load on at about 11:15, which means that if I go in there by 12:30, I've got a freshly roasted chicken. I do not want them, now according to the health department, if you do this ahead of time, I think you're allowed to keep them for 2 hours, but at a relatively high temperature. So they go into these warming bins where they're kept at a safe temperature, and after 2 hours in that warming bin, it's like a dried out old chicken. I don't want to eat it. Sometimes I get caught with one, and I get upset. But the fact is, I only like the thighs, drumsticks, and wings anyway. And I invariably take the breast, whether it's well cooked or dried out, and make chicken salad with it or something. I do something with it. One of the things I love to do, and it only requires a minimal amount of added heat, is to make a tabbouleh kind of salad. And these days what I use is coarse or medium to coarse bulgur. There's a brand that's sold everywhere, Red, you know what I'm talking about, Marshall. Red Mill, I guess it is.
Yeah.
Is a good quality, and I like the granulation. And I put that in a small saucepan with enough water to cover it by twice at least. And I start it out in cold water, and I bring it to a boil, let it boil for just a minute or even two, and then turn off the heat. By the time it gets to room temperature, that grain is already reconstituted. Now, it may be the tiniest bit chewy, which I sort of like, but once you dress it and it stands for another even just 15 minutes, it's going to soak up some of the dressing and become even more tender. So not a whole lot. So tabbouleh is actually more about the herbs than it is about the grain, but you got to have both. And the parsley makes wonderful tabbouleh, and as does mint, as does the two together. And sometimes when I want that little bit of mint flavor, I take some dried mint, which I almost always have in the house, and add it to the fresh parsley, and chop the fresh parsley with the mint mingled in it, and you'll get some of that mint flavor. So that I would say you want at least twice as much chopped herb as you have grain. Now, a quarter of a cup of grain is considered a single serving, and that plumps up to more than a half a cup. So I don't know. You know, if you did 2 servings, meaning a half a cup of grain, that's a lot of grain. I think it's a nice amount of grain.
Hey,
Hello?
you're giving me an idea.
I'm talking about tabbouleh.
Right.
But we're going to use it as a base for chicken salad because some protein is needed. There are lots of ways to dress up your basic tabbouleh. So I'm just talking about I soak the grain, but I actually bring it to a boil and then let it sit. And when it's all at room temperature, or could do that in the morning for the evening, you squeeze it out. Squeeze out all the excess moisture, put the grain in a bowl, put in at least twice as much chopped herb, mint, parsley. I don't know what else. You could put dill. That would be good. I don't want any dried herb unless it's the little bit of dried mint to give that flavor. And then you add lemon juice and oil, a proportion of about, you don't need much oil, let's say for this half a cup of now plumped up bulgur, and you got at least a cup and a half, 2 cups of herb. You don't need more than a tablespoon and a half of olive oil, and the juice of a lemon. If you like, you can dice up a tomato and put that in there. That's your classic, basic tabbouleh. However, I've been, playing with that, and here's one that became a big hit. A half a box of frozen peas. Now, the way I'm cooking frozen peas these days is I bring a small pot of water to the boil. You hear me say small pot of water to the boil a lot because it doesn't take much time. It doesn't heat up my kitchen inordinately. So I bring a small pot of water to the boil. I add the peas, frozen. They could be defrosted a little bit, but basically frozen peas right out of the freezer, and let them boil. You're going to have to let the water come back to a simmer at least, and then count 2 minutes, and then drain them immediately and just leave them there. So I would add my cooked frozen peas. Why not fresh peas? Because you try to find a good fresh pea. And by the way, frozen peas have gotten a little bit expensive. You buy frozen peas?
Yeah, because people have gotten onto them. Plus, I have to say that from a first aid note, frozen peas are really helpful to keep in the fridge. In the freezer.
Oh yes, you're right.
So yes. If I ran the frozen pea concession, I would definitely raise prices.
Well, your basic box of bird's eye peas in my overpriced supermarket, not the fancy supermarket either, the cheap supermarket, still expensive for the world, $2.69.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Pardon me?
I said, that's a lot.
Don't you think?
I do.
So I get to the counter with my peas, and they tell me they're $3.69. I said, wait a minute. Ends up, the little ones are $1 more. I don't want to go into my whole story why
the petit
I thought they were $2.60. What?
Like the petit pois? The little
Yeah,
pea?
those are $1 more. Anyway, whatever peas you use, you only need about a cup of peas for the amount of tabbouleh I was describing. And so I add the peas. So we got tomatoes and peas. Oh, and if you have this spit roasted chicken from the supermarket, or you can dice it up, the breast, and toss it in there. But my big hit has been the peas with crumbled feta cheese. Mm. Now, mind you, I do go out of my way to buy creamy feta cheese, not too salty feta cheese, and I think I've described this before. I buy this Bulgarian feta, which is considered, among the best. And it comes in a tub filled with the salt water so that it really does keep in the refrigerator for a month. There's only 12 ounces, I think, in that 12 ounces of cheese in that box. Feta goes a long way. So like the other night I talked about how now you can buy in the U.S. pre-cooked beets, vacuum packaged. Yep.
So you could basically have a pre-cooked vacuum packaged beet. You can slice those.
Beets with feta cheese or goat cheese is a wonderful dinner.
So I have
with a piece of bread.
Every summer I do this because I loved the woman who made this, who taught it to me, and I know the recipe is handwritten somewhere in my handy-dandy folder, but I'm trying to find it, of course, and I can't. But it is, there was a place called Cafe Condotti, around the corner on 58th Street between Madison and Park. It was a little teeny hole in the wall, but she served really good Italian food. And it was 1/3.
Oh, I remember that place.
Right. Flat leaf parsley, basil, and mint, all fresh, chopped up, olives and capers.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and she put it on a bucatini, but I will say this. It would be delicious in a tabbouleh.
You could. Oh, yeah. I mean, diced olives or even halved olives.
Which, because that was what's caused the salt.
It's terrific in this salad. And this is many years ago. My friend Paula Wolfert was making, and I'm sure this is in one of her books. I'm thinking Foods of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was a parsley salad with feta and olives, but it gave me a new appreciation for curly parsley. I haven't looked in the supermarket lately for curly parsley. I wonder if it's still there. When I was a kid, that was the only parsley.
Yeah, it's
was
still
curly
there.
Parsley.
It's
And it
still
was
there.
used as a garnish. Nobody thought to actually eat it unless it was
Passover, and you were really hungry.
Oh, well, okay. We didn't use parsley in my family. We used, believe it or not, we used sweet onion.
Oh, well,
Like a Bermuda onion to dip in the salt you're talking about, right?
Marshall would have been happy in your family. I was by that time so desperately hungry that I would just eat
So
the parsley.
this thought about what different families do, not just Jewish families at Passover, but Christian Catholic families at their holidays like Easter. I'm all of a sudden involved in finding my long lost cousins because I had my DNA tested by Ancestry.com. There are a couple of companies that do this now. Ancestry.com gives you like your top 5 connections. Or maybe more than 5, but in my case, it was like the top 5 connections, meaning they were second, possibly the most third cousins, whatever that means. So I contacted them all, and we're trying now. I am in touch with 4 of those 5 people now, and we're trying to figure out how we're really related. Yesterday, we came up with with one of these people. I didn't with him. I got to call him today and tell him, here's how I think we're really related. But you could trace these things by what you do, what rituals, what traditions you have at holidays.
Right.
So, like, I'm sure the onion started with my great-grandfather Reuben Sonkin. My grandfather, Louis Sonkin, was unquestionably in charge of such things as what are we going to put on the table. On the other hand, my grandmother, his wife, Elsie, was the daughter of a rabbi, the renegade daughter of a rabbi, but maybe our Passover traditions are based on her family traditions. I don't know. I'm going to start asking this. It's a good question.
It's a good way to find out. Just like on crime hotlines, they leave out a bit about. They leave out a bit about what actually happened because that's the only way to weed out people who call up and say, "Oh, I know about this."
It's interesting how this is working because I'm sure there are other people who've had this experience. But once I've been told that you might be my second cousin, which is pretty close, I want to see how we're related. And one of them. These people from my father's side of the family, and I was surprised that because I don't know that much about my father's side of the family. I only know back to my grandmother's generation. But this man and I have a mini Cohen in common, but it ends up it's not the same mini Cohen.
Yeah.
And it wasn't... Yeah, well, first of all, Minnie was a very popular name.
Right.
We had a neighbor. I laugh about this every time I think about it, but we had a neighbor named in the new neighborhood, not the old neighborhood, named Minnie. But at some point in the late 50s, early 60s, she started calling herself Minna, because Minna, if I remember, was considered classier than Minnie, and she wanted to add some class. But anyway, that's a good question. These food traditions are they're the last, I wrote about this more than once in my life. food traditions are the last things to go. Meaning, you don't speak the native language anymore. You don't dress the way they did in the old country. But definitely, at some ritual during the year, you're going to eat
like you did or like
country.
they did. No, you're absolutely right.
Like they did.
And that's
or you may be doing it way more often than once or twice a year.
That you don't
I
even
do it
know.
way more often. Pardon me?
I said that you're not even aware of. I had to do a little bit of spelunking for my brother last week, who said, blah, blah, I'm going to go blah, blah, and is blah, blah, and where did blah, blah come from? I think that he is, I think that he's Harold and Cupid's kid, but who knows, blah, blah. So I had to go back. Anyone who could tell me is long gone. And I had to go back through some just old things and piece it together. I was so happy to discover that this particular person was the first one who fled Buffalo. But
I thought you were going to tell me, Latvia.
No, fled Buffalo. But what was even more interesting, and this was totally tangential, the family, and particularly the sisters that came from it, were very particular about the story that they told everybody about how much everybody loved everybody else. And one day, the outsider, this kid's mother, comes in and she says, well, actually, there have been X number of divorces, and these people have fled, and there's maybe even a murder. And my grandmother said, after she had said all that, pay no attention to her, she's an outsider. So I said, how long have you been married to Harold? And she said, 34 years. So it's, there's a bunch of information that you can start detecting using food.
I fortunately have a cousin, Lenny Marcus, who is 87. And I just had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago. I know that except that he's got a little grumpy. He's just fine. So I called him right away when this branch of the family contacted me, or I contacted them and they contacted me back. And I said, do you know this surname, Pantel, or Pantel, depends on how you say it. He said, oh, yeah, my mother, that would be my great aunt, my mother had a Uncle Dan Pantel. Well, it ends up Dan Pantel is the grandfather of this man who called me, whose, by the way, name is Dan Pantel, and he named after his grandfather. And the grandfather was married to my blood relative, who it appears to be the sister of my great-grandfather. And I didn't even know my great-grandfather had a sister. Now, Leonard, he's not very forthcoming with family information. I pump him all the time, and he doesn't really want to. I don't think he knows, but he's a very brilliant man, and I think he doesn't want to admit that he doesn't know something.
There's that.
So, I say, what about your grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I knew, my great-grandmother? I mean, she had dementia by the time I knew her. Which, by the way, I know when somebody compliments my hair, which is my best physical quality, I should just say thank you very much. But instead, these days I say, well, unfortunately, the DNA that gave me this hair also gives possible dementia and diabetes. So anyway, that was my great grandmother. So his only comment about this is she was a cold woman. So she didn't apparently dote on him. And by the way, that's all his daughter and his niece, my other cousins, who I'm still very much in touch with. I mean, they're my friends. That's all we ever heard. She's a cold fish. Celia was a cold fish.
Well, do you know, I just, because you mentioned the name
But he did
Celia.
remember Uncle Dan.
Well, that's helpful.
And then I was thrilled to set this man straight, this new cousin Dan, because he thought he knew my grandfather. Even my grandfather was not his relative. Was my grandmother who was his relative. But my grandfather was a waiter. So I always say I come from a short line of waiters. My grandfather was a waiter, at the famous dairy restaurant on Eastern Parkway and Utica Avenue. If anybody out there still remembers the famous restaurant, it was famous, but the word famous this and famous that was very, very popular in the 19 teens and 20s. For instance, Nathan's Famous.
Yep.
And there was a famous cafeteria in Manhattan.
Because being famous was, it would be like putting Kardashian in the title of a.
Well, I
a
guess
restaurant.
it was like the beginning of the end.
It probably was. So speaking of the beginning of the end, I just.
Anyway, my grandfather was one of those grumpy old Jewish waiters at the famous dairy restaurant. He didn't retire until he was 87, which I always like to say, even though he had only one lung, which he lost in the Philippine insurrection and got a Purple Heart for. Even though he only had one lung, at 87 he switched from a life of Lucky Strikes to Marlboro because he wasn't working anymore. He needed a lighter cigarette. This is in my grandfather's words. And he lived into his early 90s. So that one lung took a lot of feeding.
But that one lung obviously had a certain...
Maybe I don't know. I don't look like my grandfather, so I look like my grandmother's side of the family, the diabetes, dementia, and curly hair side. Anyway, it's all very interesting, and this food connection, I don't know, as being Mr. Food here, how I skipped that, but one of my questions should be right away is like, what was on your Passover plate? Sweet onion, parsley, lettuce, some people put lettuce. My theory on the onion, by the way, is that in Belarus, which is where my family is from, by the way, my DNA showed that I'm 92% Ashkenazi Jew. No surprise. But the surprise was I'm 2% South Asian, meaning India and Pakistan. So one of those guys slipped in there somewhere. Anyway, so in Belarus, I mean, the weather in March, April, when we celebrate Passover, is horrible. It's worse than New York, which isn't so spring-like yet either, necessarily. And in these cold climate, their agriculture, what did they produce? Potatoes and hence potato kugel at Passover, and onions, and they had garlic, they had onions. Those are main flavorings in Ashkenazi cooking, and certainly you didn't have anything. The onion stands for spring. That's why parsley is used in American families, and I guess a lot of Ashkenazic families too. And then there's lettuce, but who has lettuce in Belarus in April?
I don't. Yeah, probably not.
I mean, you don't have lettuce in Sharon in April. You got to wait till June to get lettuce.
You have to wait for June in Belarus too.
Think about it. You can only eat what you have.
That's right.
So this brings me to a much happier subject: capers, because this is the caper harvest time in Sicily, and well, actually not just Sicily, all over Italy by mid-August. And one of my my hot weather salvations is capers, because all you have to do to make them edible is soak them in cold water for a bit. I mean, a little bit, they're salty, and if you soak them for a long time, they lose the salt. I use salted capers. So you can buy these in the supermarket now. 10, 15 years ago, only could get capers packed in vinegar. And a pickled caper is okay for certain uses, but not for my uses. My main uses are to make it with a tomato salad, or to add it to tuna fish, or I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. We just had for dinner sliced tomatoes with a tuna caper sauce that you usually would put on braised veal or boiled veal, tonnato, a Vitello tonnato, one of my favorite summer things, but I don't want to braise a veal shoulder for 2 hours on my stove. I go to. By the way, I do know a restaurant where you can get this very well made. Now I got to think of the name of it. It's on 57th Street and Lexington Avenue, and I'll remember in a minute. It may actually not be there anymore. Last time I spoke to the chef owner, he was having as everybody in New York is, having lease problems. The landlord wanted to triple his rent or something. Teodora. See, if you don't really concentrate,
No, then you can't.
then it comes to you. The restaurant is called Teodora, and they do make excellent Vitello tonnato in the summer. And in that, and by the way, my tonnato, my tuna sauce, which is just I just whipped up in the processor a can of tuna, about 3/4 of a cup of mayonnaise, and too many capers. So I learned my lesson. And you could always throw an anchovy in there and just make it into you basically have tuna mayonnaise. You could also just do like half a can of tuna in the mayonnaise, and then in the end, after you spread some of the mayonnaise on your sliced tomatoes, you can put the crumbled tuna fish on top of that with some capers. So don't overdo the capers because it got too capery. By the way, capers, people think capers are kind of related to fish or something.
They do?
Yeah, I've heard this.
Sorry.
So when I do cooking classes, I always do my little spiel on capers because capers are free in Italy because they grow wild. Yes, there are caper farms and they commercially harvest, salt, dry, salt again, and put in a jar for your consumption. But they grow wild all over the place, mostly out of stone walls, which are all over the place. And if you want to see an interesting little video, I'm sure she must have posted this on Facebook, but my friend Judy Witz-Francini, she is an American woman who lives in Chianti, near Siena. And she, as she says in her little video about capers that she posted yesterday, I believe, it's a free food because she just goes out near, and anyway, she does a great explanation of capers. And I didn't get through the whole video this morning, but I wouldn't be surprised if she gave you some uses for it. But if you look at, and her website is called Divina, Divina Cucina, Divina Cucina. As I said, she's been living, I don't know how many exactly, but I'm guessing 25 to 30 years she's been living in Italy. She was a pastry chef at one time in California and San Francisco. And I think the story is, she told me more than once, but I think the story is she actually went to Europe, to France, but somehow ended up in Italy and then married this man she fell in love with. So for 25 years she's been in Chianti, married to an Italian, and cooking like an Italian. How she's bearing the heat, I don't know.
All right, well, we're out of time.
Yeah, I know we're out of time. According to my clock, actually, we have another 40 seconds.
Yes,
but
we do. We do.
Okay.
Don't be like that. All right.
Let's remember, I've been on the radio for 30 years.
And we are glad.
I can time myself, even though I'm a blabbermouth.
Yeah, we're all
anyway, so there we go.
Well,
I'm having tabbouleh and roast chicken today, but I'm not roasting my own chicken.
I understand.
keep that oven locked.
Okay. Take care, guys. Have a great, cool week.
Okay.
You too. Thanks.
Arthur Schwartz, the Food Maven, here on Robin Hood Radio.